This is Talking Work. I'm Deborah Ishihara. What's the optimum birth rate for a country, and how can we ensure we have the people we need in different countries of the world for the workforces of the future? And crucially for us, what do employers need to be aware of now about these issues? Welcome to Talking Work, the employment law podcast by Jus Laboris. In each episode, we invite a different guest to discuss what's happening in the world of work. If you're an HR professional of any kind, this podcast is for you. Just recently, my colleague Susanna Gevorgian was lucky enough to be able to interview the very erudite Professor Wolfgang Lutz, founder of the Wittgenstein Centre for Demography and Global Human Capital, and a professor at the University of Vienna. Professor Lutz talked about demographic change, and in particular the issue of low birth rate, and it was really fascinating to hear his insights. I'm going to play that interview for you now. Enjoy.
We are analyzing birth rate trends across various countries. And we have noticed a significant decline in the fertility rate in higher income countries. But at the same time, we have also observed localization, like, for instance, the dropping fertility rates in Eastern European countries. If we refer to research papers, they suggest that there are four primary drivers of this decline. Women's empowerment and education, access to health services, lower child mortality, and the cost of raising a child. As a leading expert in the field of global population development, I would like to ask for your perspective on the significance of these drivers and whether there are any other important factors that we should consider.
Okay, thank you for the question. So if we look at the recent trends in fertility, I think it's important to look at the big picture first. The big picture is all societies in the world have been going through a process that we call demographic transition, which means that in traditional societies, the birth rates and the death rates have both been high and, as we say, uncontrolled. The death rates have been determined by diseases, famines, war, and so on. And then it started in Europe in the late 19th century. We saw a decline, child mortality, other mortality rates. And then, with some lag, some decades later, usually also a decline in the birth rates, where women also started to have a less fatalistic attitude. A fatalistic attitude meaning as many children as God gives me, and not planning your own family size, but have sort of a specific planned family size, which could be two, three, or four children, or whatever. But it was this transition to planning that is also closely correlated and also caused by literacy, more education of women. So this process in Europe, the fertility rate started to decline at the beginning of the 20th century. And that's why when the death rates were already low and the birth rates still high, we had very strong population growth. That's why so many millions of Europeans left for North America or Australia. And then in the 1960s, we had a similar development in much of Asia, particularly in East Asia. Southern Asia coming a little later. And at the moment, we see the same thing in Africa, where the death rates have already declined and birth rates are still high in many countries. That's why we see still significant population growth in Africa. This theory of demographic transition seems to hold quite well, but it is rather unspecific as to the point like how low will fertility fall in what we call the post-demographic transition countries. Here, the old assumption as implemented, let's say, by the United Nations population projections for many decades until recently, was that all countries will converge to two surviving children per woman. That's what we call the replacement level fertility. I mean, there was no substantive reason for assuming this, except that would be creating sort of a new stability that countries would stay pretty much at the same level of population if also life expectancy stops to increase further. So there would be this assumption of convergence. But in most countries of the world, fertility did not stop at the replacement level and fell below. And yeah, the question is how far it can fall below replacement level. The United Nations, for instance, as well as our own projections, assume that in the long run it will somehow go to, let's say, 1.7 or 1.8 surviving children per woman. But in recent years, we've seen much lower falls. You may have heard the lowest really is in Korea now, where it's only 0.7 children per woman on average, which is just about one third of the replacement level. Even China, where the UN assumed it has never fallen below 1.6 and is on an upward trajectory. Even there, we hear it's now like 1.2 or 1.3. So why is fertility falling so low? Well, it really at that point when it comes to controlled fertility, sort of very few unplanned births. Couples, and in particular women, make a choice when they want to have children and how many. It really becomes very much a cultural issue. The dominant explanation these days is why in some highly developed countries we see higher fertility, somewhat higher, like in the Nordic countries or in France, is that there it is easier for women to combine a professional career with a family role, with having children. Because there are good childcare facilities, husbands tend to be willing to also take part of the burden of child rearing, and then you can afford to have typically the two children that couples desire these days in Europe. Why is it much lower in southern European countries, like in southern Italy? It's really very low. In Spain, it's low, and even lower now in East Asia. And the answer there, it is precisely because of somewhat more traditional family roles. There's still the old division of labor that men have to go out and work and women have to stay home with the children. So this is still a very strong social norm. And it is precisely because of this traditional norm that women who now are also educated and have the opportunity for a professional career have to make a choice. They have to make a choice. Either they go for their own career or they go with the traditional norms and stay at home and stay with the children. And more women are, for understandable reasons, choosing the first option, which means that they will stay single for longer. If they marry at all, they marry at a later age, and if they have children at all, they have children at a higher age, and typically a smaller number of children. So it's precisely these traditional family norms that lead to the very low fertility. Also, this sounds sort of counterintuitive to some people. Now, you ask in particular about the Eastern European countries. I mean, in Europe, we see a differentiated pattern. It is important to know that before 1990, before the end of the Cold War, actually Eastern European fertility was somewhat higher than Western European fertility. Partly because the government heavily subsidized the work of women outside the house. Like a good example is East Germany compared to West Germany. They first had a decline pretty much in parallel in the 1970s, but then in East Germany, the government really stepped in and they built a lot of childcare facilities, much more than in West Germany. And also housing. If a young woman got pregnant, she got government subsidized housing immediately. So there was actually an incentive to get children early on because then you get free access to housing. So all these special features of support, which were part of the socialist ideology in Eastern Europe, collapsed around 1990, 91. And as a consequence, the birth rate declined even steeper to a lower level than it had been in Western Europe, because this was a new situation for young families. And I think these discontinuities still explain some of the differences that we see today. Okay, this is the one question. What are the reasons and what are the patterns we observe? The other question is sort of what level of fertility is desirable? That is a complicated question, but we've done some simulation models. So, what is the optimal level of a birth rate to benefit the well-being in the population, both in an economic sense and in the broader sense? And in particular, if you factor in that the young generation is going to be better educated and more productive, the optimal level of fertility is likely to be below 2 children. We estimate somewhere maybe between 1.5 and 1.7, depending on whether you also take environmental change and climate change into account, or what you factor in as the cost of having children. So in that sense, fertility as we have it in much of Western Europe, but also in some of the Eastern European countries, I don't think is a major reason for concern. If you have fewer children but invest more in the education of the children, in the socialization of the children, then this may just be the right thing, particularly in times where artificial intelligence or whatever will take away some jobs in the future. So you will not have too many unemployed people. The question is, what fertility is too low? Well, if it goes like we have it in Korea these days at 0.7, I think that will cause some major social discontinuities that will also be not so good for society. And of course, in the short run, it also saves money for education and childcare and so on. But in the long run, it will lead to a very significant population aging and the lack of young people. And if just think in terms of individual families, there will be lots of single children who have many grandchildren or even living great grandchildren, and the family trees will sort of dry out. And that,
Actually, another question is that if we really drop below desirable level, what we can expect, how the labor market will be changed, like what will be impact exactly on the labor market?
uh, well, there are sort of two fears at the same time. The one is that people are afraid that there will not be enough workers in the future due to the low birth rate. And at the same time, there's other people seem to be very much afraid that the increasing automation, artificial intelligence, other robots taking some of the work will cause lots of unemployment. Well, maybe these two trends are actually benefit each other. If there are fewer children, that is a good thing because there will be fewer unemployed things. But we have to make sure that these fewer children are indeed much better educated, because we still need people with the skills to program the computers, to supervise the artificial intelligence. But this is less going to be a routine work. It's more gonna be a very highly educated, highly sophisticated work.
I would like to thank you for your really, really very important thoughts on the topic.
Well, thank you very much. I hope it is helpful for your work.
I hope you found that as interesting as I did. We've just released our research on low birth rate in key countries and what employers need to be aware of, and you can find a link to our series page in the notes to this episode. You can also find my details there, and you're always welcome to contact me on anything to do with employment law. And if you need to know who to contact in a particular country, say, I'll put you in touch with the right person. Do browse around our website, by the way. There's loads of information there on all sorts of employment-related topics at usaboris.com. Thanks for listening, and join us again. That's it for this episode of Talking Work, but we'll be back very soon with more insights from our guests from around the world. If you've enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast. You can also visit usaboris.com to access all our content, resources and tools.